Well, we live in fearful times. Certainly, we've just spoken about it, we've prayed about it, and in fact, we know it by experience. So much fear is present in society that there's a group from Chapman University in Orange, California, that's commissioned an annual study called the Chapman University Study in American Fears. They didn't run the study last year because of the pandemic, so the most recent data we have from them is from 2019. But I thought it would be interesting to think, they were surveying Americans, what are the things you fear the most? And so they ranked American fears. And well, I'll just give you a hint. The number 2 thing that Americans fear the most, I was surprised to hear this, the number 2 thing we fear the most is pollution, which I thought there would be some things we would fear more than that. But can you guess what the number 1 fear is? In fact, kind of lean to the person that you came to church with today and guess, what do you think the number 1 fear that Americans have is? I'll give you a second to chat about that. Are you guys ready for this? The number 1 fear that Americans had, I would have guessed death. I would have been wrong. The number 1 fear Americans have is corrupt government. Of all things, over 77% of Americans say they are very afraid of a corrupt government. So Chapman University followed up on that poll with a 1-question poll as we anticipated the election last year. And the question was, do you fear the results of the 2020 election? And guess what? Over 47% of the people surveyed said, yeah, I'm freaking out about what's going to happen in the election. Much has changed. Much has changed in the world since Isaiah addressed Israel as exiles in Babylon 2,600 years ago. But one thing remains the same. Fear, specifically fear of geopolitical events. And so as we dive into Isaiah chapter 41 this morning, let's think about how the seats of political power can shift suddenly without our permission. We feel powerless to control how people in charge might wield their authority in ways that affect our lives. So what would God have to say to people who fear political upheaval? And we see the answer in God's word through Isaiah to people living in a time of political upheaval. So let's dive right into Isaiah chapter 41. Here's our first point this morning. The cause of fear, at least in this section, is geopolitical upheaval. Let's read the first 5 verses as we dive in. Listen to me in silence, O coastlands. Let the people renew their strength. Let them approach, then let them speak. Let us draw near together for judgment. Who stirred up one from the east, whom victory meets at every step? He gives up nations before him so that he tramples kings underfoot. He makes them like dust with his sword, like driven stubble with his bow. He pursues them and passes on safely by paths his feet have not trod. Who has performed and done this, calling the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, the first, and with the last I am he. The coastlands have seen and are afraid. The ends of the earth tremble. They have drawn near and come. Okay, so what's happening in this passage? Well, verse 1 begins with God calling the nations to court. So there's all these nations doing all these things to kind of gain power, and nations rise and nations fall, empires rise and empires fall. And some of the nations are thinking like, we're in charge, we're super strong, we're super powerful. And God says, okay, you seemingly strong, you think you're powerful nations, let's go to court. And just one question on the docket as they come to court, and the question is this: who has the power behind the power that's causing these nations to rise and fall? Notice in verse 1 what it says: let the peoples renew their strength. Now I find that really interesting. God's saying as they're coming to court, I want you guys to kind of man up and bring everything you've got. Why is that important? Because it contrasts so clearly with what Isaiah has just said in his last chapter. If you were here last week, you might remember as we focused in on these verses. Remember this: God gives strength to him who has no might. Those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. But instead of waiting on the Lord to renew their strength, these nations think they're strong in and of themselves. And so God says to those thinking they're strong people, bring all the strength you have, and we're going to answer this question about where does the ability to exercise power actually come from? Well, things get specific in verse 2. And in verse 2 it says, who stirred up one from the east? Well, what's happening to the east that somebody's being stirred up? Who is this person from the east? Well, anyone who lived in the time of the Babylonian Empire, when this message was being read by these Israelites in exile in Babylon, surely would have known that the one being described was King Cyrus of Persia. So here's what was going on geopolitically at that time. Babylon was the dominant world empire. They had conquered much of the known world, but there was a little rumbling to the east. And a guy named Cyrus became king of Persia in 559 BC. And not too long after, he defeated the Medes who were in charge of his people. And then he began sweeping across the known world. And faster than any empire had ever conquered, so went this King Cyrus. In fact, the text tells us a couple things. It says Cyrus is coming, and he's coming fast. Verse 3 said he is treading paths his feet have not trod. That's flying language. He's moving so fast, it's as though his feet aren't even touching the ground. Just Cyrus is coming, and he's coming fast, and he's coming powerfully. Notice it says in verse 2, he meets victory at every step. He's making kings dust and rubble, and then he's coming invincibly. Verse 3 says he passes safely. Now, I don't know much about war, but I do know this. War is not a safe thing to be doing. And yet here's Cyrus warring safely, as though he has a shield of invincibility and nothing can touch him. And here comes Cyrus. And as Cyrus is sweeping across the known world, he begins taking the land to the north of the Babylonian Empire, a place called Lydia, where King Croesus, who was this rich and most powerful guy known to humanity at the time, just disposed of like dust. And he's taking parts of northwest India, and he's taking Asia Minor. And people are saying, Cyrus is coming. Cyrus is coming. And so it says that the coastlands have seen and are afraid. What does that mean? It's like the farthest places where there is land before there's this ocean. And at that time, the ocean was like the end of everything. So it's like as far as there is land, everybody hears that Cyrus is coming. Now, here's the thing about emperors in that time. When an emperor conquered, the emperor could do whatever they wanted. And when an emperor conquered a new place, it typically didn't go well for the people who were living in that place. Emperors came and they imposed their will. And so here are God's people, Israel, in exile in Babylon. And they have suffered under the Babylonians for year after year after year. And now they hear that Cyrus is coming, and they couldn't stop Babylon, and they're not going to be able to stop Cyrus. And they're thinking, what are we going to do? How are we going to weather this next storm? So they have these nightmares about what's coming to them. And every time they have a nightmare, there's not a version that doesn't end with them speaking Persian. And they're thinking this is going to be a disaster. And maybe you too are in a place in life where you're facing something hard. And anything you think of that could be coming down the pike doesn't look like it's going to end well. And there's something coming that's out of your control. And whether it's a diagnosis or a boss at work or a political reality, you're looking around thinking, this is hard. What does God say to those of us who live in fear? To those of us who every time we turn on our TVs and watch the news, I don't care if you're watching MSNBC on the left or Fox News on the right. They might be saying different things, but I think they're giving us the same message. You need to be afraid. Be very afraid of your opponents gaining political power. Be very afraid of what these people might do to you. What do fearful people do? That's our next point. The nation's response to fear. The nations have two responses to fear. Both ineffective, honestly, both fairly stupid. Let's look at those in verses 6 and 7. Here's the first response in verse 6. Everyone helps his neighbor and says to his brother, be strong. It's a locker room scene. Have you seen guys kind of pumping each other up before a big game? And they put their hands on their shoulders like, man up, you got this, be strong. And that's the scene here. But you know what it reminds me of? Have you watched some of those like natural disaster movies and things are falling apart? And I'm not thinking of any specific one of these movies here, but just kind of the idea of those movies. And imagine one of those movies and here's a father and his son stuck in a high-rise building and a 75-foot tsunami is coming. And so the camera pans and they show how all the lanes of traffic are going out of the city. And they're realizing that they can't get to the car to get out of the city. And even if they got to their car, the traffic is too much. And they realize that they're stuck in this building and the storm is coming. And so the dad grabs his son and says, "Son, be strong." And as I'm sitting in my oversized, comfy couch at home, do you know what I'm thinking as I hear that? Dude, it doesn't matter how strong you feel. It doesn't matter how strong you are. The tsunami is coming, and you are about to be eviscerated. Whether you feel like you've got it all under control or you feel like you've got nothing under control, it's coming. And I think that's the point here in this passage. Cyrus is coming. Whether you tell yourself to man up, whether you tell yourself to be strong or not, it's still happening. The nation's response of mutual support is laughably ineffective. So what do they do next? Well, verse 7, they begin to trust their idols. Isaiah takes us back to idol-making school to make a point about idols. It says, the craftsman strengthens the goldsmith, and he who smooths with a hammer, him who strikes the anvil, saying of the soldering, it is good. And they strengthen it with nails so that it cannot be moved. What is Isaiah trying to say about idols? A couple things pop out at me. The first thing is this. It's pretty dumb to trust in something you made to protect you. See, there's this taxonomy of power, right? Like if I create something, I have more power than the thing I created. So if I fear something because it has more power than me, but I trust an idol that I made so I have more power than it, do you understand? Like I trust the thing with less power than me to deal with a thing that has more power than me. How's that working out for you? Here's the next thing. They made the idol and said of the idol, it is good. Now, those are three really important words, and don't skip over them as you read, because those words call us back to Genesis chapter 1, where God creates, and God looks around at the earth he's created. And you remember the three words God spoke over creation after he made it? It is good. So we're kind of mimicking God by creating like God, and we're like, oh, look, what we made is good. But is it really? No, this is a Romans chapter 1 moment where we worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator, where we exchanged the glory of the immortal God for lesser glory. And we worshiped an idol instead of God, and we said to metal or to stone, save me. And yet, look at how powerless these idols were. They were strengthened with nails. Why? Because if you've got a God that you're worshiping and being like, God protect me, and it's just like metal statue, and then a little wind comes, what does the breeze do to the idol? Just boink. And so they would nail the idol down onto its idol pole so that the idol wouldn't fall over. And Isaiah's kind of laughing at them, right? Saying, your idol has to be strengthened. Again, don't miss the contrast. Isaiah keeps repeating this contrast because he wants us to remember there's a contrast between those who would be strengthened by the Lord, those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength, and those who try to strengthen themselves even through idols. Some of you guys this morning are like, okay, whew. You know what I didn't do, Pastor? I didn't pull out my gold Buddha monkey statue and put it on my mantle this morning and worship it. So I'm good on the idolatry. That's not really a thing in my life. But hear this. An idol is not just a piece of wood or stone that we fabricate. An idol is anything that we trust to bring us peace and security instead of God. And as we talk about geopolitical upheaval, we probably need to talk about political idolatry. Because so many of us can fall prey to believing that a person or a politician or a party is the thing that can rescue or deliver us. We had a pretty contentious election last year, didn't we? Last year on the election trail, about this time, the statement was made, you must not vote Democrat because Joe Biden, if elected, will hurt God. I thought about that for a second. If you believe that Joe Biden or any politician can hurt God, you got way too high an opinion of Joe Biden or any other politician and way too low a view of God. Because there is no one in the sphere of human authority that can do anything to thwart the power that God has. And Joe Biden nor any other politician can even get a sniff of God because of how great and powerful God is. We need to get our eyes off specific people and politicians thinking they're going to be the one to save me, because how does that bring us into political idolatry? Here's why. Because if you need help, you need someone with more power to help you, right? And so if we say a politician can hurt God, so we need another politician to help God, what we're saying is God is here, but this politician has more power than God because he can help God not be hurt. And I just want us to realize that God does not need our help because he has all power in the universe already at his disposal. God is not looking down from heaven at the results of our elections trembling as though someone is going to climb up to heaven and throw him off his throne. God is in total control. We trust him. Absolutely. So how do we purge our fear that leads us to idolatrize politicians or any other people or things? We look to God's response to our fear, and God gives 3 responses to our fear. The first response to our fear, we look back to verse 4. The first response to our fear is that God is in control of history. So as God brings the nations to court, as Cyrus is coming, the question is asked, who's performed and done this? As in, who is allowing Cyrus to run through the known world and conquer it all? Now, Cyrus, if asked, why are you doing this? Who's giving you the power to do this? Cyrus probably would have said, Cyrus has the power to do this, or the gods of Persia are giving Cyrus the power to do this. But God says, time out, let's recheck that. Cyrus does not have the power, and Cyrus's gods do not have the power. Any power Cyrus is exercising is God's power that has been granted to Cyrus. And God says, you need to get a new view of history that tells you I'm in control of it. That's why the last phrase of verse 4 is so important. I, the Lord, the first. With the last, I am he. See what God's saying? He's like, any person in power, from the first person who conquered in human history until the last, God did that. God raised up the first. God will raise up the last. And everything that happens in history is God unfolding his plan. And God is unfolding the plan that he has made before the foundations of the world piece by piece, and no one can thwart what God has planned. Here's why that matters. Not only is God in control of history, but God is with us throughout history. So verses 6 and 7, how the nations respond to fear. They have this false bravado telling everyone to man up. That doesn't work. They trust in their idols. That doesn't work. Verse 8. But, stop right there. Best word in Scripture. But, it's a great word of contrast, isn't it? The nations are freaking out. The nations are trusting themselves and their idols, but you don't have to do that. Why? But you, Israel, my servant, But you, Jacob, whom I have chosen, but you, the offspring of Abraham, my friend, you whom I took from the ends of the earth and called from its farthest corners, saying to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you and not cast you off. God said, before I get to the point of what I want to tell you, I want to remind you of your history. And God says, let's review a few points about who you are, my people. And God says, the first thing I want you to see is that you are chosen. And not by merit, but because of mercy. Not because of who you are, but because of who God is. God said, I chose a people because I wanted to pour mercy on a specific group of people. And he said, I chose you. And he said, I took you from the ends of the earth. I brought you from a far country. I think there's a double meaning in this. The first meaning is the historical meaning. If you think back to how the nation of Israel came into being, there was a guy named Abraham. And Abraham wasn't a nation. He was just a dude, and he lived in a far-off city called Ur. And if you know anything about the time when Abraham lived, the power, the big national empire at that time was Egypt. Everything that was happening was in Egypt. And God looked over to this random outpost of a city called Ur, to this random old dude in the city of Ur. And he says, hey, Abraham, I'm going to choose you, and I want you to move. And think about that, because people didn't really move in that culture. I think that's because they didn't really have Mayflower moving trucks. It's kind of hard to load all your stuff up onto donkeys. They don't really haul stuff as well as a U-Haul. But God says to Abraham, I want you to put all your stuff on a donkey and start going and go to a new land. And Abraham's like, what land? And God's like, just go. I'll show you. And Abraham begins journeying. God says, I'm going to bring you to a land. I'm going to give you that land. I'm going to make you a great nation, and I'm going to make you a blessing. And so this random guy from a random country travels to the nation of Canaan, and God establishes him in that land. And eventually his descendants under King David begin ruling that land and conquering the land around that land and expanding its territories. And God said, I did that for you. I took you from a far country. But I think there's a double meaning, I said. And the second meaning is this. It's not just the biological children of Abraham who were given a physical land and conquered some lands around it, but the true descendants of Abraham, Scripture tells us, are not those who share Abraham's genes, but those who share Abraham's faith. And so God is taking people who share Abraham's faith from every corner of the world, from every tongue and every tribe and every nation, and he's making us into a nation of priests, a nation of kings under our King Jesus. The true descendant of Abraham creates a nation of Abraham's offspring. And God said, if you believe in Jesus with the faith of Abraham, the same power and privilege and protection and peace that were granted to Abraham's first people will be granted to you. One last thing about the history. It says this twice in the passage because Isaiah wants to emphasize, but you, Israel, my servant, I said to you, you are my servant. It certainly appears in this passage that the servant of God is the collective group of Abraham's people, these biological descendants of Abraham. I find it interesting, though. Remember I said that Abraham's true descendants aren't those who had his genealogy, but those who had his faith. See, here's what's going on, and this is kind of setting up where Isaiah is going in the next couple chapters, so this is just by way of preview. The nation was supposed to be the servant. You see it there, right? Twice. You're my servant, but they didn't do a really good job of serving for God. The servant wasn't, by the way, just doing menial tasks. It wasn't like sweep God's floor and bring God his coffee in the morning. It was, I want you to exercise God's rule and reign on the world in God's stead, to do what God would want to be done in God's world. And so the nation was supposed to do that as God's servant, but they didn't get that done. So what's going to happen is God's going to raise up one individual servant to represent the nation and do for the nation what the nation couldn't do. And that suffering servant will become Jesus Christ. And so everyone who belongs to the servant, who's united with the servant, receives the peace and the protection and the provision and the promises that the servant inherited as the representative of God's people. And so What's happening here is this: when you're facing all this turmoil and you need peace and protection and security, where do you look? Do you look to what's happening around you, or do you look to the servant who, if you trust him, you can actually have that peace and protection because you become part of God's people? Do you look to the cross, where Jesus allows those of us, like the nation of Israel, who don't deserve God's favor on our merit, but can receive it because of his mercy? Do you look to Jesus and say, Jesus, I give you everything I am. You take my past and my junk and my shame and you demolish it on the cross. And I give you the rest of my life, my trust, and all my ways. And if that's what you do with Jesus, he folds you into God's people. And that means that the promise with which Isaiah is going to climax this section applies to you. So all of this has been building towards this climax. Do you see it here in the text? But you, Israel, my servant, and he recites all the stuff he's done for Israel in the past, as though to say, I've done this for you throughout history, but I'm going to continue to be with you in history. So how do you respond? Verse 10, here's the key: fear not. I love that. Two little words. In a culture that says fear always, in a culture that says fear many people, fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. That's a promise. Have you been to the pool this summer? One of the community pools? When you go to a community pool, one of the things you're likely to see is a little toddler standing on the edge of the pool thinking about jumping in, but not sure. And can you just picture this little girl hovering over the side of the pool, and down in the water is her dad? And what's dad saying? Jump on in, it's okay. Why? I'll catch you. I'm right here. I'm with you. My hands are strong enough to hold you. And isn't that the picture that God is offering to us? You can jump into the turbulent waters of life because I'll uphold you with my righteous right hand, God says. I've got you. There's nothing that can happen that I cannot grab you and hold you up. God's providence and protection happens because we have his presence. His presence is with us throughout history. And all of this, by the way, is pointing to that suffering servant, that true and final offspring of Abraham, Jesus Christ. We know that because of how Matthew frames his gospel. The Gospel of Matthew is actually bookended with two key phrases that make this point very clearly. When Matthew starts out his gospel, an angel shows up and says to Joseph, I want you to name this child Jesus, or Emmanuel, which means God is with us. The last thing Jesus says before he ascends to heaven, when he gives the Great Commission, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, therefore go and make disciples of all nations, etc., etc. And then he says, and surely I am with you always, even to the very end of the age. Why can we have peace and protection? Because no matter what happens around us, Jesus is with us. It's as though we're rocketing on a train towards all that God has for us, and we want to look out the windows and see the scenery and fear what's going to happen, because how can we be headed anywhere good when we're traveling through lands that are so bad? And Isaiah comes along and says, fear not, because the destination is secure. You don't have to look at what's around you because you can trust what God has ahead of you. Which leads us to our third and final point. God is preparing a new creation that transcends history. Verse 14. Fear not, you worm Jacob. I read that and I was like, whoa. That's kind of a mean way for God to address his people. Like, he's just given us all this good stuff. I'm your dad. I've got you. You can trust in Jesus, and you worm. Okay, why is he calling us a worm? A couple reasons, two reasons. First reason he's calling us a worm is because worms are kind of powerless. Do you remember like after a rainstorm, when you were a kid, did you ever do this? After a rainstorm, you'd go out in your driveway and there'd be all these worms crawling around. Did you ever like take your shoe and play like Pop a Worm and just kind of see how many you could get? And, well, maybe that was just me. Not a good time to be a worm is the point of that story. And worms are powerless and need protection. But not only are we like a worm, powerless and needing protection, but the context gives us a clue about the job that worms do. Worms are little tiny earth movers. They don't move a whole lot of earth, but just a little bit of earth or dirt, these worms move. And so God is saying, what you can only do in a little tiny powerless way, God is going to multiply your efforts. In fact, check this out. Fear not, you worm of Jacob, you men of Israel. I am the one who helps you, declares the Lord. Your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. Behold, I make of you a threshing sledge, new, sharp, and having teeth. You shall thresh the mountains and crush them, and you shall make the hills like chaff. You shall winnow them, and the wind shall carry them away, and the tempest shall scatter them. John Deere wasn't invented yet. So the most technologically advanced piece of farming equipment that they knew of at the time was a threshing sledge. And so it'd be these two poles tied together with an animal pulling it. And what they were pulling was this metal implement that would plow the ground. It was how they would prepare their fields for the planting of seeds. And God says to Israel, we're going to take that threshing sledge and you're going to become it. But instead of threshing smooth dirt, you're going to thresh the mountain. And so thoroughly will you thresh the mountain that it will become like dust that just can be blown away. And obviously this is not a literal picture, it's a metaphor of what God is going to do to recreate the world. Because here's what's happening. The people of Israel see Cyrus coming and they're fearing the world that would be remade as Cyrus comes. And they're picturing in their nightmares this dystopian atmosphere of all the bad things Cyrus can do to them. And God says the world will in fact be remade. But it's not going to be remade according to your worst nightmares. It's going to be remade according to your best dreams. Because Cyrus isn't remaking the world. God is remaking the world. And he's going to remake the world in such a way that all the mountains that stand in your way will be removed like dust. And then he gives another picture of this new creation. He says, when the poor and needy seek water and there is none, and their tongue is parched with thirst. And he reminds us that just as he said we were a worm, now we're powerless and thirsty. But God reminds us of our position of need so that he can point out his position of strength. And he says, when you have nothing to offer, I give you everything because my gift is a gift of grace. And he said, when you are in a desert, dry and thirsty and hurting, I will open rivers on the bare heights. I'll open fountains in the midst of the valleys. I'll make the wilderness a pool of water and the dry land springs of water. God says, I'll give you the water you need. But then he says this, verse 19, I'll put in the wilderness the cedar, the acacia, the myrtle, and the olive. I'll set in the desert the cypress, the plane, and the pine. Why these 7 trees? What's the point of these 7 trees? Here's the point. Israel, the land where they used to live, they got hauled off into exile. They're living in Babylon. Now another emperor is coming to take over Babylon. And they're remembering the land they used to have. And God says, I'm going to raise up trees that are native to Israel, to your promised land, because you're going back. And God says, I'm going to put you in the land with the trees. And I love that. Notice he does not say, I will plant them so that they may grow. He's like, I'm going to put mature trees in this land. Why? Because only a miracle could bring mature trees into a desert. And God says, only a miracle can bring you, my people, back to the promised land that you left so many decades ago. But the picture, hear this, the picture of God's people returning to the promised land was a preview of what God has planned for his ultimate people. in the new creation. And that's why God uses that word create. Do you see that at the end of verse 20? The hand of the Lord has done this. The Holy One of Israel has created it. The one who created the world that got messed up is going to take all the muck and the mire and the mess of that world. And we think out of muck and mire and mess can only come chaos and distraction and disease and destruction. And God says, but in my hand, I'm going to mold it together and I'm going to remake a world for you. And it's going to be everything that the world was supposed to be. And it's going to be holy and it's going to be pure and it's going to be lush and it's going to be radiant with the glory of God. And I'm going to put you in that land. And so no matter what is happening around you, you can trust that that land is being prepared for you. And God says, you don't have to worry about the disease you see. You don't have to worry about the boss who's in control over you. You don't have to worry about who's in power in Washington or any other country, because God is in control. And you know how the story ends. And if you know how the story ends, you don't have to worry about how you're going to get there. You can just sit back and enjoy the ride and trust that the God who said, this is what's coming, has the power to bring you there. So we reject fear and we cling to faith. When the world around me says, fear everything, fear everyone, I say, I trust Jesus more than anything or anyone, and he will bring me through. So I don't know exactly what you're facing this morning. I don't know if you're walking through a season of difficulty, if you're walking through a season of fear. But what I can tell you is you can bring all of that to the foot of the cross. And Jesus said that he will gift you a peace that is more than anyone can understand. So whatever you're facing, why don't we just take a moment and bring it to the Lord and say, God, I'm dealing with this and it's tough. I don't know how I'm going to get through this. It's hard. But I give it to you. And so, Lord Jesus, we give you all of our fears, believing that you can transform them into faith, helping us to see that as you've been in control of history up until this minute, you'll be in control of history until the final minute. So we trust you. Give us faith that trusts no matter what. Give us faith that trusts even when we don't see. Give us faith that trusts even when it's hard. Because, God, you are the only one worth trusting in. So we give you our trust this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.